The Print of the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in alliance with Indirect Apollo Hospitals, airline partner SpiceJet.
So first of all, give me a drone's eye view of India's economy. Are we in a crisis? Are we in trouble? Are we in an epoch of opportunity? Are we the same as before? Just sort of waffling along. आप ड्रोन में हैं और ड्रोन आई से बताइए.
Any good that you actually use the metaphor of drones, given the recent conference on drones that happened.
Right.
So I think I would have no hesitation in mentioning we are at the epoch of opportunity. And allow me to explain why I think this is the case. If you look at India's COVID policy response, and especially the fiscal policy response, which actually included both demand side and supply side measures, India has been singularly distinguished in identifying that the COVID pandemic actually creates huge supply side disruptions. Let me actually mention of some data points. See, if you look at in the advanced economies, inflation is almost 4 times what it was. 2% is what has been the historical average in the US, Eurozone as well, around that. 8%, so 4 times as much. And that's because they actually just did Keynesian demand priming, very little on the supply side. In contrast, India actually identified very early and therefore took supply side measures. And on the demand side as well, used the financial sector, which is loans with guarantees. The advantage, and I had written about this in the Times of India as well, a piece that when you actually have guarantees given by the government with loans, it actually acts as a quasi transfer to the genuinely poor, distressed. At the same time, also gives money to those who are distressed. So by the combination of that information that financial sector has, which the sovereign never has, and the leverage that financial sector provides, India actually spent very prudently. And therefore, we actually look at, and just some more data points, comparing the previous crisis versus this crisis. The previous crisis, India had double-digit inflation for 1.5 years, retail inflation. We now actually, and I'm taking up till December because that was sort of the COVID crisis. What we are seeing now actually is just, and that is important because when we infer, the fact that we are in an epoch of opportunity, the way we've dealt with the COVID is very important. So in contrast, up until December, inflation on average during the crisis period was 5.6%. Current account deficit was basically, close to 5%. 4.8%, in contrast, surplus of 0.9%. Fiscal deficit compared to peer economies, and that comparison is important, was 2.5 times during the GFC. Now it's 90%. If you look at currency depreciation, almost 60% in the GFC, now 0.06%. If you look at the capital expenditure,
can you explain this 0.06%, because your peers will understand, but most people like me will not.
So in the sense that actually, if I look at the start of the crisis period, which is March of 2020, take the rupee dollar value and take end, December 2021, which is basically, I'm taking as a COVID crisis period. Similarly, the global financial crisis period of 2008-09. So I take the ending value of the rupee dollar and the beginning value, and what is the percentage change? That's basically, so to repeat, 56% depreciation during the global financial crisis, and almost negligible 0.6% in the COVID period. Why did this happen? Because one of the, as I said, supply side measures. If you look at capital expenditures, in the COVID, and this is where in the economic survey, we actually provided the intellectual base for saying that we should do fiscal capital expenditures, because it has a huge multiplier. So capital expenditures increased by about 13.5% during the COVID period. In contrast, if you look at in the GFC, capital expenditures declined by 5%, and you had revenue expenditures then increasing by about 27%. And as a result, capital formation in the economy actually during GFC declined by about 4.5%. Now it has increased by 2.5%. So when you take all this together, the fact that we basically did not just dole out checks, right? And even those checks that were doled out then were primarily to those that already had money in hands. So you look at the macro fundamental, and that is why I actually am saying that we are in an epoch of opportunity, because if we had what we did, the same Keynesian demand priming, we would have basically been in a similar situation. The way, if you think about it, in order to understand, in the rainy season, what is the effect of taking an umbrella? You have to say, if I don't take the umbrella, I will get wet, I will get sick. So that counterfactual is what is important. So if India had done the same policy as the advanced economies now, or during what we did during the global financial crisis, we may have had 4 times as much inflation, some fiscal deficit that is 2.5, 3 times, macro fundamentals which have been very, very poor, would have been part of the fragile 5 or fragile 6. Turkey, for instance, which is part of the OECD, now has 70% inflation. Argentina, right. 60% inflation. Brazil, 12, 13%. That tells you why I think, we basically are in an epoch of opportunity. I think the only part that has actually sort of dulled this opportunity to some extent is the timing of the Ukraine war. Because as I've mentioned again and again, growth requires private investment to increase, and war creates uncertainty. And so that uncertainty has basically, private investment was starting to ramp up. It's it'll have to wait for the war to get over for private investment to get back. So that is the part. But I think overall, the way we've emerged from the from the COVID crisis in terms of macro fundamentals, I think really generates the epoch of opportunity. And I think last point I'll mention, 2022 now, global economy is expected to grow at about 3.5%. It may slow down further, if these war persists. India will grow at around 8%. And going forward in this decade, India will definitely be the fastest growing economy in the world. And I think that, for me, shows the epoch of opportunity.
Well, just a little footnote, because not all our viewers are economists or finance people. GFC stands for Global Financial Crisis. All the mess, the catastrophe, the end of the world feeling that the global market saw in the fall of 2008.
Correct. So, and just to add, Shekharji, the reason I'm comparing that is actually, you have to compare a crisis to crisis. And just a little bit more color, see, there have been lots of debates. Actually, people have written about growth during one government versus another. See, when you look at in normal times, the impact of things that were done previously, that is there. How is the global economy doing? There are many other factors. It's not just, policy. But when you look at a response to a crisis, that is just the capability of the government, the intent of the government, their ability to think really. I think a response to the crisis, actually, the way it shows up, the ability of a government and its, the depth of its economic thinking, I don't think normal times show up. And that is why I've used that, and actually to say that the epoch of opportunity is indeed coming.
Well, I think a lot of the criticism comes from the growth slowdown in the year before the pandemic.
Yeah.
That 2017 onwards, growth was on a downward curve.
Correct.
And the year before the pandemic, it had become very low. In fact, Dr. Subramanian Swamy tweeted today saying that was the lowest growth rate in the past 50 years. So what was happening before the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's a good question you raised. And actually, this is, I'm going to refer to the readers, especially those that are interested, to go and check this out. We did rigorous research to show this, right? So in the 2019-20 economic survey, volume 2, the state of the economy chapter, had a full section on the slowdown, the reason for the slowdown. And I'll explain to our viewers in a way that is easily understood. See, when a crisis starts from the financial sector, the crisis is, the overhang, which is basically something that even after the crisis has passed, the impact that is felt from that is much longer. There's a lot of research, even IMF and others actually have shown. In contrast, when the crisis originates in the real sector, which is, your normal, your L&Ts of the world, or, other Infosys of the world, etc., real sector versus the banking or the financial sector. When the crisis originates in the financial sector, and this you can also see, take the global financial crisis versus the COVID crisis, for instance. COVID crisis, that year, there was actually a recession, right? Big recession, in 2020 and 2021, basically growth bounced back immediately. In contrast, GFC, if you saw, decline. Then actually you had the European, sovereign debt crisis, a bunch of other things that actually conveys this just anecdotally, but research also shows that when problems originate in the financial sector, the overhang is significant. And this is the crux to understanding the slowdown. If you recall, actually up and that's what we've shown rigorous evidence of this in that particular section, that the crony lending that was done up till 2013, and this kind of crony lending has never ever happened in independent India. The magnitude of that crony lending, we know all the names. Actually, if you watch The Bad Billionaire, for instance, you can actually get what I'm talking about. That magnitude of crony lending, and then the cascading effects of that, which is basically first, the fact that these loans came back to boost. The reason that this happens is financial sector. Why is the overhang so long? Because banks first evergreen. They don't want to accept. They will continue giving loans, saying kuch gadbad nahi hai, sab theek hai actually. So they will not recognize it. Then when the regulator pushes, and you remember, and this is something we also showed in the 2021 economic survey, the Reserve Bank actually forbeared for 7 years. Regulatory forbearance is supposed to be emergency medicine, not staple diet, but they continued that emergency medicine for 7 years. As a result, a lot of evergreening happened. Problems were not recognized. It's as if I need a triple bypass, but actually, God forbid, I don't need that. But actually, you keep applying Band-Aid on that, on the left side of my heart. Now, things will basically from triple, it'll go to a quadruple or maybe a, 5-5. That's what actually happened, the post moment. And then risk aversion, because there was actually obviously crony lending. And so, some of the people had to be actually sort of some identification of those who did the hanky panky had to be done. Risk aversion, and look at the credit actually. By far, if you look at the overall credit itself, over 20% it grew, a lot of it because of the crony lending up until 2014, and because of the cascading effects, and which actually there's a ton of research that shows that financial sector, from messing with the financial sector, the problem is just huge. And that was the main reason for the slowdown. Even what you saw with the NBFC crisis, right? IIFL, etc. So when banks withdrew, these NBFCs came in and actually repeated the same phenomenon in some sense, and therefore you had the credit basically slowing down significantly. So typically this is how it's mentioned. If suppose economy, the credit has to grow at X%, credit has to grow at 1.5x. So if you need a growth of 6%, you need credit to grow at 10%. So you can back out from there. If credit therefore slows down, growth will slow down as well. And that was the main reason. Let me also say, there are a lot of commentators who will basically say it was demonetization, it was GST. There is research does not support that as all. There's a paper by none other than Geeta Gopinath, who was the chief economist, and now the deputy MD at IMF. She and her co-authors go and look at demonetization, find no evidence at the macro level of actually impact on growth. In fact, that's why they try to look sectorally. And that's why. So the evidence is very, very clear. I don't want to go by anecdotal or narratives, but research clearly shows that this narrative that it was demonetization or GST is not quite. And look at GST now, some of the changes that have happened now, 180,000 crores, right? Obviously the effects of that is really coming in.
GST, I'm with you. Demonetization, I'm not. And if I remember that IMF paper correctly, I think that paper showed that there was an impact for 2 quarters. But again, I will disagree with you in the sense that when a government does something so suddenly and so abruptly in the markets, for entrepreneurs, it's like an exercise of state power that nobody's prepared for, and it makes people uncertain. And entrepreneurs they don't have spines, right? Entrepreneurs have skills, they don't have spines. So then for quite some time, this fear remains that, government has so much power, we don't know what they will do. But that's an argument that we can carry forward.
No, so I just want to let me correct that, right? At this, when they do the statistical tests for growth effects at the macro level, they do not find. That's why they go and look at it within sectors. That's the bottom line point that we have to keep in mind. And I think this is a paper published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the best journal, in economics across the world. So I know I'm not, mentioning this based on my own volition.
Well, I mean, if I was better at math, maybe I would have become an economist. At least I would have studied basic economics, but I haven't. But I tell you what I see as somebody who studies political economy more than economics. Now, today's situation, today, if you look at realistically, there is higher inflation than before. Central bank is raising rates, which will have an impact on growth and credit. It's also making money tighter, money supply tighter. We have a massive unemployment problem to address which we need growth. So fuel prices are high. Inflation in key areas, that is food and fuel, is high. Doesn't look like it will get better. Where does it leave us?
So I think that short term, I see this is a phenomenon I've observed, especially is that, in India, we tend to overreact, on both sides. So for instance, when things start getting better, we'll basically start saying, basically heaven has arrived. And when, things are a little down, we say, oh, all hell has broken loose, right? The reality oftentimes is a little, in the in between. And I think that is something that I've observed, having, looked at the Indian economy over the last 20, 25 years. I think that's the first point that I wanted to say, that, yes, there are the war clouds actually, are creating some of these problems, the supply side aspects. I'm not a war expert, so I don't know when it'll end. But if somebody can tell me that, the war will, let's say, end in month X, then I can tell you that maybe from month X+1 or X+2, a lot of this economic activity will come back, because what it is creating is uncertainty, especially on the investment side. And as we know, investment is a long gestation, project, and therefore corporates will be in wait and watch mode. But I think the fact that, India has handled COVID really well, this is just a pause button that actually corporates have put now, to say, okay, let's pause and see when the war goes. So now let me respond to your specific comments on inflation. So I think a couple of important points that I want to mention. And for instance, around July, August of last year, I'd actually mentioned that inflation, it was a little about.
Can I interrupt for half a second, because you're on the inflation question?
Yeah.
So I have a question also on inflation from Ramakrishna Prayag, who's Associate Vice President at Jindal Steel and Power, who's asking a connected question. So I thought it's best to take it together. And he says, the Indian economy is in the throes of inflation. What is your assessment of the same and palliatives needed thereby? So since you were getting there, I took the liberty of interrupting you.
I think that's an excellent, actually, it's sort of, you get to hit two birds, I guess, with one stone. The first point I actually want to mention, and last year around, July or so, even in my public statements, I had said that inflation will actually come down, and it indeed did. Now, similarly, I am actually, when I look at the trends now, a couple of things. One, if you look at, we just mentioned that the global economy, is likely to slow down. US, Europe, and even China, because of the lockdown, etc., there's going to be a significant impact on growth. What that will mean is global demand obviously will decline, going forward, number one. And number two, which is that if you look at a lot of the commodity prices, for instance, whether you take, cement, steel, iron ore, many of them are actually down between 20 to 40% over the last year compared to their peaks. So which is actually symptomatic of some of the demand coming down, number one. So there is some demand side actually sort of, a mitigation, that will happen going forward, which then has to be factored in when we walk the very tight rope, between growth and inflation. And this is basically, for monetary policy, which I have to, I have to really mention that there are a few aspects that we have to actually keep in mind. Number one, unlike the other advanced economies or emerging economies, India's fiscal policy has actually given, or at least gave ample room to the Reserve Bank to continue in at least a neutral mode, and that's something that has to be recognized. Therefore, commentators that only look at the global economy and say, "Chalo, rate raise karo," actually basically say, they're not taking into account the differences. Point number one. On the same spirit, on differences in the Indian economy versus the global economy. First thing, if you look at investment versus consumption, and a lot of people actually oftentimes do not take this into account. Let's start with consumption. What part of consumption depends on lending? Unlike in the advanced economies here, it is basically houses, maybe a car, maybe a two-wheeler. You borrow for basically buying these things. In India, nobody borrows to actually eat. We don't do that. Okay.
Right.
So when lending rates are
and very few borrow to go on holidays. Some do,
exactly.
But very few do.
Very true as well. So only durable goods consumption, which if you look at overall consumption, not a very significant proportion. This is only retail, right? Retail actually gets impacted by lending rates. Point number one. In other words, when rates are raised, actually the impact on consumption is not very large. In contrast, all of investment actually depends on lending. So, when rates are raised, actually the impact on investment is far more than that on consumption. The point number one. Point number two, and this is an aspect of the Indian banking sector. When rates are raised, our banks pass the rates immediately. But when rates are decreased, they do not pass the declines. And so when you take the full cycle, let's say, and the full cycle must be the tightening and the loosening. So I raise it by 1% and then I decline it by 1%. When I raise it by 1%, banks will pass it on immediately and especially to the smaller borrowers. But when the decline happens of 1%, they will not do it. There are enough deputy governors and governors who actually lamented about this phenomenon, that when the monetary loosening happens, banks don't pass it on. What will this mean?
In fact, if I may interrupt, just to buttress your point, when central bank loosens by 50 basis points, banks then do a great favor by cutting 10 basis points.
Exactly. In contrast, if basically central bank increases by 50 basis points, the banks will pass it on fully, 50 basis. And this indeed actually is because there isn't adequate competition in the banking sector. If you just as a comparison, if so, in the United States, having lived there for a decade, if suppose there is a monetary policy cut, and I suppose have a loan from Bank X, Bank Y will approach me and say, I will give you now at a rate that is lower, and that is the effect of competition. We don't have that much competition, and that's why this happens. So what does that mean then for monetary policy? That first, as I said, the impact on consumption is much lower than that on investment. Now, add to that this part that actually bank lending, bank rates will increase far more and not decline as much. So when the full cycle is through, you will be still at lending rates that are actually borrowing rates much higher than what we started with, which will have another impact on investment as well. So now, as a policy maker, I have to take the full cycle into effect, which is, and especially given the emphasis on growth through private investment, this is an aspect that has to be kept in mind. Final point, and this is the third aspect where India is different from the rest of in India, both the labor markets, or basically just our overall economy, has a lot of informal sector. In the United States, Europe, etc., what happens is, and this is what the economists use what is called this Phillips curve, which is basically a sort of a trade-off between inflation and output, which is actually conditioned on the formal sector, where when basically rates increases, wages will go up and so on, then cost push inflation, etc. But when you have an informal sector that accounts for almost at least 2/3, maybe 70-80% of output, all this action that actually we are extrapolating from the advanced economies happens in the 1/3 or maybe 20% of the formal sector. So that's the other thing. So these are three key points that must be kept in mind when we think about the inflation versus the the output trade-off. And this is where actually I will mention it again. In fiscal policy, India had the courage to actually be positively different, not just copy paste what the advanced economies were doing.
In fact, if I may add, that is what our friend Ruchir Sharma also wrote in his column in FT, because he looked at all the countries who just threw money at the market.
Yes.
Just printing money, printing currency to buy their way out of trouble.
Correct,
and they are all in deep.
Exactly. But India did not do that. Yeah. Now, if we can have the courage of conviction and the clarity of thought to be able to be different from the advanced economies on fiscal policy, I think I would basically exhort, urge, pray that on monetary policy as well, we need to factor in, think deeply about, actually understand the theory very well, apply it very clearly to India, and not just copy paste what the advanced economies are doing. That requires courage of conviction to be different, and the confidence to say, I have thought this through, and therefore actually we can be different. I think that is what is extremely important.
Are you then saying that we should not be in too much of a hurry to tighten as fast as the advanced economies are doing?
All I'm saying is, I think, the Monetary Policy Committee and, the overall, those policymakers, I'm saying this based on extensive, this is an area, banking sector, I understand like the back of my hand. Right. And having now worked in the government, fiscal policy, monetary policy also, I understand. And the financial sector is a very, very critical element of monetary policy. And I've explained actually why India is different. So I think these are very carefully thought through inputs that must be taken into account to ensure that this tightrope walk is actually done very carefully, and with basically the depth of thought and the courage of conviction to actually implement policy that is right for India, even if everybody else, every commentator, and actually remind you, right, when we basically did in the 2020 or so, every other commentator was saying Indian economy is going to basically go to the dogs. And yet, we basically went and said there's going to be a V-shaped recovery. That required, the clarity of thought and the courage of conviction. Same thing is what is required now. I think, fiscal policy has played its hand. Monetary policy, I think, needs to basically, learn from fiscal policy during COVID and exhibit the same courage of conviction and depth of thought.
Dogs, as we've seen lately, do very well. They only get their owners into trouble occasionally. After that cheap shot, question from one of our subscribers, Prashant Krishnamurthy from University of British Columbia. And he says, can you talk about the rationale behind the PLI scheme with some positive examples such as Apple and negatives like Ford pulling out of India, out of EV manufacturing, and issues with IT hardware?
Yeah. So let me first explain the logic for, so I'm going to club two things, not only the PLI scheme, but also the overall, for instance, the change in the MSME definitions that was done also as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat policy. Whoever has asked, what was the name of that person who asked?
Prashant Krishnamurthy.
Prashant Krishnamurthy, as it turns out, my father's name was also Krishnamurthy. Oh. So Prashant ji, I would urge you to actually take a look at the chapter that we wrote in the 2018-19 economic survey on dwarfism, among our small and medium enterprises. See, the basic phenomenon is, if you look at the research, if you take, let's say, India and compare it to the United States or even Mexico, this is a very telling fact. In India, if they say, I take a 5-year-old firm and then track it basically over the next 35 years when it becomes a 40-year-old firm, do the same thing for the United States as well. So let's say, we basically run this race by making both 5-year-old firms actually in India and the US, let's say, had 100 employees when they were 5-year-old. Now run this race for 35 years. In the United States, that firm, 5-year-old firm on average that created 100 jobs is creating now almost 800 jobs, 8 times. In India, in contrast, that same firm has just gone from 100 to 140. Let that sink in. From 100 to 140, in other words, just a 40% increase in employment when the firm becomes 40-year-old versus a 5-year-old. In the US, it is basically 8 times almost, right? 8 times. And that tells you the impact on job creation in the formal sector. This is the phenomenon of dwarfism, which is that in our country, firms, age, but they don't grow. And, you'll hear a lot of political and otherwise narratives saying, oh, small firms create jobs. No, that's not correct. It's small firms that grow that actually create the jobs. I think that qualification is extremely important, for small firms that grow. And, think about it. Look at jobs that an Infosys created. Actually, if Infosys had remained a really small firm and did not grow to become the Infosys that we know, or a Wipro or any of these firms that they all started 25, 30 years back as small firms. And look at the number of jobs that they've created. You look around, you'll see that it is the small firms that grow, that create jobs. And actually and so the reason we actually implemented the PLI scheme, and the key part of the PLI scheme, is that you will continue getting incentives that taps into the taxpayers' money only if you grow. And that is the key point. Similarly, the change in the MSME definitions as well, it is to actually attack this phenomenon of dwarfism, which is, and why is that important? Because again, let's think about it deeply, right? Our firms, are not able to compete as well to, a lot of the international firms. Why? Because, what we economists call it economies of scale, which is that if you're at a higher scale, you actually end up, having much lower costs. And in India, what happens? So take, let's say, the kind of labor laws that we have had, in the last 70 years. If you become a firm with more than 100 employees, you have to comply with, all kinds of regulations. In some sense, the rule book is thrown at you, right? So what does an entrepreneur do? As soon as he reaches 95 employees, he'll say, चल मैं अपने साले के नाम पे मैं firm चालू करता हूँ, या फिर बीवी के नाम पे, or maybe actually in my driver's name. So what you have is basically, if you have 5 firms, each of which is 95 employees, or basically close to, versus a 500 employee firm, the 500 employee firm can compete much better with international competition, be much more export competitive. And so it actually means that we can't compete with imports. We are not as, attractive on the export side either. And that is why this phenomenon is something that India needs to tackle from its, through its policy. The PLI scheme and the MSME definitions actually are primarily change in the MSME definitions are intended to attack this problem. If we have to have job creation, which is something that you asked, actually, some of these structural issues have to be addressed. There is no, again, I'll use that example. If you have need a triple bypass, putting band-aids is not going to basically save you. So I think, these are some of the structural issues that we've, tried to address through the PLI scheme and through some of the Atmanirbhar Bharat changes.
Okay. Our subscribers are really smart. So Atul Sharma, some politicians have been saying lately that India is on its way to becoming like Sri Lanka economically. What is your view on such claims?
Okay, I think we've already discussed, Shekharji, a lot of, how India responded to COVID. Let me take a couple of minutes to, to explain to our viewers what went wrong with Sri Lanka. See, firstly, they borrowed in foreign currency, number one. India has not borrowed, and they borrowed actually significantly, but based on what assumption? That their tourism sector in Sri Lanka was a very attractive tourist destination. And that they basically, now, let me sort of be very honest here and say that nobody anticipated COVID. Even Sri Lankan policymakers did not anticipate COVID. They felt that the tourism revenues should keep coming. And so in some sense, the tourism revenues were sort of the collateral for these, foreign currency loans that were taken. Now, because COVID happened, their tourism revenues have dried up. Foreign exchange reserves are actually very low. They can't afford a lot of imports. They were importing a lot of stuff, and that has had a lot of cascading effects. And they also they cut corporate tax rates, or I think even personal tax rates significantly, went into, sort of organic farming, all of which wouldn't have been a problem if basically their tourism revenues had continued to be good and they would have had the foreign exchange. I think none of these were actually the core cause. The core cause was the drying up of tourism, and then a lot of these have basically added on to the woes. In some sense, in Hindi we say that Bhagwan jab deta hai tab chappar faar ke deta hai. Even in crisis, actually, that happens many times. All these factors end up adding up. Now, India, in contrast, actually, as we said, firstly, India is singularly distinguished in a positive way in the way we've actually dealt with, with COVID. So in those who have even a wee bit of understanding of economics will clearly see what I'm saying, that anybody who says that India is basically, maybe like Sri Lanka, doesn't even understand the E of economics.
Well, that's a good point. So let me be cheeky. Since you have said for the 4th or 5th time that India handled COVID very well,
fiscal policy and
yes.
and yes. Happy to interact with the others.
But your predecessor, who's also an economist, he's been based on his modeling looking at a figure of nearly 5 million dead, which is 10 times as much as Government of India's figures, and which then conforms to figures given by many modelers, including WHO. You have a view on that?
Yes, of course. Let me go back to a chapter that I wrote in the 1920 economic survey on an earlier claim about GDP growth. Anybody can go and read that chapter, and it is quite interesting that not a single person, not a single commentator could find any holes in that chapter. It's possibly the most sophisticated, econometrically, well done chapter, which clearly dismantled the claim that there was anything wrong with the GDP growth. And, just go and read the abstract of that chapter, Shekharji. Actually, maybe viewers
what you mean is there was anything wrong with the new way of calculating GDP growth. Yes.
But I know I'll make the connection. Just give me a. So, and I remember even when that working paper had come, it was a working paper. Remember, it is not a peer-reviewed paper. I think this is something a lot of our viewers basically don't understand. When it gets published in a journal, it is something, it goes through the peer review process. And I can tell you, as an academic who's actually published in the best journals, this paper, even if it was presented in a PhD student seminar, leave alone sent to a referee, would have basically been dismantled in a PhD student seminar. I have the same view about the paper on basically COVID deaths as well. Even for WHO too, they do not use actual deaths. The other important point, let me explain. And actually, there is some work that others are also doing. One of my batchmates from IIT Kanpur at Stanford is also, his student has done some work there, which I think has not oftentimes caught as much attention. So while there are some scholars who basically are saying X, using models and benchmarks that I find quite dicey, there are others who are actually saying it as well. So the first point to understand is, if I have to define quote unquote abnormal deaths or excess deaths, when I say excess, then I have to define or estimate what is normal death in any year. And that has to take into account the overall data process, that basically there is. And even in normal years as well, leave COVID, there is a lot of volatility in this data, all of which has to be taken into account when you estimate what is the normal death. And, and as I said, and that's why I gave the example of the GDP growth paper. If actually a careful econometric exercise is done, and I'm sure somebody will do it, I actually can again tell you that this kind of claim. So these are actually, there's a consistent theme to it, which is that, that even if the work is not rigorous, which is what a scholar basically should be focusing on, if it creates a sensation, that's fine, because, it's anyway a working paper, but I think if such stuff gets published and actually using actual death data, with registered death data, I would be keen to look at that and then comment on it. Bottom line, whether it is the GDP growth paper or this paper, I do not think it passes the smell test of careful scholarly work. So I would not give any credence to the results. And I am saying it based on based on proof. I think those who are interested can go and read that chapter on GDP growth, completely dismantle that claim, actually showing that, it was basically just a completely, baseless claim. I think a similar phenomenon is basically at work in this case as well.
So you are not a believer in modeling in this case?
No, I am very much I actually do, but the modeling has to actually be careful. As I said, so let me explain, right? That the normal deaths can only be estimated through a model. You need a model. But the model actually, and that's why we all, when we do our PhDs, we learn econometrics. We actually are taught for 2 years how to disentangle basically, sort of the difference between correlation and causality, and that chapter that I mentioned, starts with this quote from an anonymous, that correlation is the basis of superstition, while causality is the base of science. So when you have only correlations, which is what these studies, the GDP growth or the, or the COVID deaths paper are, they're not establishing causality or, in a way that is very, very convincing. So I think I would wait for good work. I, of course, believe in models, but the model has to be done, modeling has to be done very carefully, something that passes muster with a careful econometrician. And I actually do careful econometrics. So these do not pass muster with me.
Well, so I come back to one of our regular questioners. He's Sanjay Agarwal, who's MD and CEO of AU Small Finance Bank, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's one of our success stories. And he says the measures taken by government on reducing excise duty on fuel and reducing various duties on commodities would impact government revenue on one side, while higher subsidies on fertilizers and agri will further increase government spending on the other side. How will we manage the overall impact on already higher fiscal deficit?
So here, I think this is a good question. I will refer back to the chapter on counter-cyclical fiscal policy that I'd written. In my opinion, actually, that I think is important because it marks an important change in the way we think about fiscal policy. Between just giving out doles or revenue expenditure versus capital expenditure. And the central point, there were two key points, which is when you take a measure like, let's say, debt to GDP, right? Debt to GDP, what you have in the numerator is debt, and the cost on that is basically interest payments. So when your interest payments are higher, actually, you will have more obligations. In the denominator is GDP growth effectively. So your GDP grows based on GDP growth. So let me give you a simple example. Let's say I borrow 100 rupees, right? And I actually make, let's say, 10% in a project that I'm investing in. And the interest rate that I pay, let's say, is 7%. So which means that, I can actually repay 107 rupees, when the loan is due, keep 3 rupees and actually reinvest again. So in other words, if the growth rate is higher than the rate of interest, then debt will actually be sustainable. Point number one. Point number two, and this relates to the first point, which is if the higher borrowing is put in capital expenditure in basically infrastructure, then the what we economists call fiscal multipliers, which is just jargon for I put 1 rupee, how much did the economy generate? That is much higher with capital expenditure. So growth effect is much higher. So when you instead of giving out doles or just subsidies, if capital expenditure is done, growth rate is higher. That is what makes debt sustainable as well, and that's the point to keep in mind. I think the other point to also remember is that our GST revenues are looking up very well. So I think the space to be able to do this is good. Last point I'll say, this is something which I forgot to mention when you asked me about inflation. A couple of days back there was a piece I wrote in the Times of India, showing that states need to follow up on their VAT cuts, and I think there were a couple of important, facts that was pointed out as opposed to narratives, which is that, many states charge higher taxes than the center. So the claim that actually center charges higher, at least at this point, is not clear, number one. Number two, even compared to other states, the neighboring states. So when, states say, oh, we don't have let's say the decision to make, on to decide taxes, etc. So if you compare across states itself, there are many neighbor states themselves who actually charge much less. There, everything is the same. Ceteris paribus, apples to apples comparison, and yet you have several states who actually charge much less. So the case for those states that have not cut their VATs actually after the Diwali cut last year, November 2021, many of them, I think the case is very clear, and citizens need to actually put pressure to basically on this and make sure that the facts are separated from narratives.
Well, we'll make sure that Mamata Banerjee, Uddhav Thackeray, KCR, Stalin are all watching, and Arvind Kejriwal, etc., all watching this.
There are, I think, I showed basically, apart from that, there is, so you have Maharashtra, West Bengal, Kerala, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, and Madhya Pradesh as well. These are basically the outlier states on excise duty cuts. So, it is basically across the spectrum.
Yeah. The Shubham Batra, who's my colleague, and he's in charge of business and economy coverage at ThePrint. he pops the oil question that, Indian economy, Indian inflation, the value of the rupee, deficits, everything seems to be linked to crude prices. So how long will it be before we can get reasonable freedom from this?
I think that's it's a very good question, but a difficult one for me. I am not an oil sector expert. This is, I think maybe Shekharji, you should get some oil sector expert. Let me say from an economic perspective,
they are proven wrong more frequently than stock market analysts.
Well, I think that just tells you that predicting any market is very hard.
Right.
Any prediction itself is very hard. I think to give, sort of acknowledge the difficulties where there are. But I think overall, only when we sort of move away substantially from fossil fuels and move substantially into renewable energy sources, only then can I actually see our dependence on crude oil actually decreasing significantly, because otherwise I don't think there are any short-term fixes on this. There are a couple of things that have happened earlier. What used to happen is that fiscal deficit used to burgeon a lot, because there was administered price on petrol, diesel, kerosene, etc. Now the fiscal impact actually is lower,
it's being passed to the consumer.
Yeah, and that actually I must point out, because there'll be a lot of reviewers will sort of contest this, and I actually want to explain that. Suppose I actually run a restaurant, let's say, or maybe I run a dhaba, right? Now, if I actually the price of pyaz, aloo, tomato, etc. goes up, and let's say I was charging basically, let's say 10 rupees for a bagan bharta. Now, if these go up, I actually should be charging 12 rupees. Now, in a similar way, I think all our viewers need to understand, and this is important because given the socialist period that we've had, a lot of our people, we many times think that government has an Akshay Patra. What Akshay Patra basically is used saying, jab Akshata dalta hai, it's like you can keep taking it out. It never goes empty, right? But no government, and it's not just the Indian government, no government in the world has an Akshay Patra. In other words, money does not grow on trees. So if basically a dhaba, somebody who runs a dhaba, if his costs have gone up, he is legitimate to actually, to increase the price. I think the same thing has to actually be, we cannot basically have two separate rules, saying one rules for government and another for normal private producers, because there is no Akshay Patra. Actually, if crude oil price goes up and if rupee dollar changes as well, the base price itself changes. And this is something which our viewers have to understand using the parallel I've given for the, for basically the dhaba.
Of Bhartanomics.
Nice one, I must say.
Which reminds me that this is something that Dr. Manmohan Singh had also said, that money doesn't go on trees. Nevertheless, UPA government continued to subsidize fuel prices, and we got into a real mess. I'm on your side on this. It's an unpopular view, but government should not subsidize fuel prices. So there's a linked question from Sarabhi Roy, our subscriber, who asks, how will alternate fuels like ethanol impact Indian economy? Please explain cascading effects and impact on inflation.
Yeah. So see, first thing that happens is that, and this, I think it's a good question. The various factors that affect inflation in terms of, and let me first talk about the crude itself, right? If the crude oil price changes in dollar terms itself, $35, for instance, during COVID versus $100 plus now, that is the first thing. Second, because, the price that we basically have, Indian consumers face, the cost of that is in rupee terms. So if rupee dollar exchange rate changes, that's the second factor. Above that, there is basically then the central excise, which by the way is fixed amount. And fourth is the state taxes, which are ad valorem. Ad valorem is basically just a jargon, economist jargon for saying it's a percentage. To give an example, let's say, if a state like Telangana or Maharashtra, the ad valorem rate is 26%. So if suppose, the excise duty decreases by 8 rupees, then the VAT that comes to actually Maharashtra will go down by 8 rupees times 26%, which works out to be 2.08 rupees. For a Kerala, for instance, where the ad valorem rate is 30%, it will be about 2.5. So that's how the state taxes impact. So these are the four components that affect the fuel price that we pay. Fuel price also has an impact actually through what we economists call second round effects, which is again jargon for the fact that, tomatoes, onions, potatoes, rice, wheat, everything has to be transported. And when it has to be transported, petrol and diesel prices basically matter. If they are higher, then transportation costs go up as well. That impacts actually, that's what we call second round effects. But I think the bottom line that we have to understand is in India, retail inflation is what we should be focusing on, because that is what the consumer faces, and not wholesale price inflation. So retail inflation has actually been 7.5%, in recent months. Retail inflation, half of that comes from food inflation. Half of retail inflation comes from food inflation, of which vegetables, especially tomatoes, onions, and potatoes play a very important part. Rest of it, so if you take fuel overall, and there was an RBI study which actually, I've looked at it carefully as well, including the overall price that you pay on just your own transportation and the cost of food items increasing because of transportation costs. Overall, it works out about 7 or 8%. So overall, 50% about for food, and fuel is about 7-8%. Then other items, miscellaneous actually, and edible oil, pulses. These are the other two very important within food itself. And this is primarily driven by what we economists call supply, which is because all of us consume pulses, we consume oil. Demand for that is not changing very much. India does not produce adequate amount actually of pulses and oil seeds, and that is why we have to import. So, for instance, now when Indonesia after the war, put basically a ban on palm oil imports. Now, palm oil actually is a very important.
Palm oil exports.
On palm oil exports, so imports for India, basically their exports, so imports for India, and that then basically raised prices, and that contributed as well. So overall, going forward, we have to actually, create crop diversification so that, both pulses and oil seed supply of that increases, so that inflation coming from that part is actually reduced. And I think, as I said, crude, I don't see, unless we move into significant amount on renewable energy, that is something that I don't think. And this is something even in other countries, advanced economies as well. When fuel prices, crude oil prices go up. For instance, I remember when around 99, 2000, when the prices were about $1.50 per gallon. While around 2008, 2009, if my numbers are right, I remember it well, it was about $3, $3.50. So this happens everywhere. India is not an exception, and this is something that our viewers must understand.
So the last couple of questions. First of all, from Nimit Mehra of Zio Auto, who reminds you that you are a proponent of nudge theory.
Yeah.
So what if any nudges can the government do from a policy perspective to counter impact of climate change?
I think that's it's a very good question. So I think there's a lot that can be done, especially on if you look at the overall climate change that is happening. It is the fossil fuels are a big part. So if we, for instance, first thing we can nudge, rather than each one of us, let's say, traveling on our own private vehicles, if we can pool together, when I used to live in Atlanta, for instance, Atlanta had a separate lane, lane, basically only where people, if you had 4 people in the car or you could travel in that, and actually you could go at a much higher speed. So this will be a nice nudge to do, which is if you are actually pooling in 4 people in the car, then you can take the fastest lane in the highways. Similarly, I think public transport investment in that significantly should be increased, and electric vehicles in particular. I think that's something which will help a lot in climate change, especially the other aspect, which is overall not only is India, far more vulnerable, even though it is the advanced economies that primarily have been the contributors to the climate change, to the global warming, the reality today is countries like India actually are far more vulnerable. So I think, at every village level now, there should be nudges in terms of, ways in which we actually should encounter. For instance, there are ways of actually collecting water. Explain to people, put up actually posters of people who actually are doing very well, coming up with ideas for saving water. And thereby, encourage that sort of community feeling and a little bit of a nice healthy competition among people. Arey, usne kiya hai, main bhi koshish karta hun. That kind of, these are all aspects that actually, but I think this question, in fact, actually prompts me to think more. To be honest with you, I've not thought about how nudge policies can be implemented far more in climate change. But the question itself actually prompts me to think more. I'm just responding impromptu here.
So when you've thought this through and write an article, send it to the print. We'll be happy to publish.
Sure. I think that because the question came in the interview, I think that's a legitimate point that you've made.
So at which point I'll take my last question. But before I get there, I will just mention a few of our subscribers whose questions I was not able to take for paucity of time at your end. But many of these questions you have taken in your sweep already. So Mahesh Bhutani, who wanted to ask if it is said that US markets will fall if Ukraine war ends. Is it correct? You've already said nobody can call markets. There is also V. Ranganathan, who said, what steps would you suggest to empower the states to independently raise resources, maybe next time? Shashikant Dubey, that question you've partly answered. RBI has to manage, control inflation, but at the pace at which it is increasing repo rate or proposing to control liquidity versus the pace at which inflation is increasing, is RBI behind the curve? You said this is a process that needs enormous amount of intellectual thinking, and you think that there is sufficient brain power there. Ayushman Mukherjee talks about India's digital payments policy. That's a little out of syllabus for today. And finally, from my young...
I think the digital, it's a good question. I'll try and keep the answer very short. I think that's, remember your first question about the epoch of opportunity. I think the digital economy actually especially presents that, because if you look at other countries and take, for instance, the United States, the digital infrastructure is being created by private players. In contrast, in India, it's been created by the sovereign. Why is this important? Because digital infrastructure, like any other infrastructure, is a public good. And so if, private sector does it, there'll be monopoly pricing. In contrast, here, it's been done by the government. Huge opportunity for the private sector to really come up in giving credit, markets, etc., to use the digital economy. I think that's a really important part of the epoch of opportunity.
Well, that's great. And then the final question from Nikhil Rampal, who has a master's in economics, Punjab University Honours School.
Wow.
And he's a data journalist, who says that, it's great that GST is going up, VAT's going up, fantastic, but aren't indirect taxes regressive? So what can be done? First of all, do you agree that indirect taxes are regressive? And second, what can be done to improve our share of direct taxes?
I think that, again, today I must say some questions, some very good questions.
That's because I didn't ask many. Other people ask.
But this really befits an MA in economics. I think kudos to him. So I agree with, conceptually, of course, I think indirect taxes are the economists call they create deadweight costs and because these are on consumption primarily. But I think, there are very few countries where, this is not done at a stage, maybe where we increase our direct taxes significantly. I think that's when maybe we can, do away with. But I think a rationalization of the indirect tax structure is, I think, something that will actually enable further compliance. I must mention, the increase is because of a lot of algorithms at the back end, artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms, etc., have been implemented. Now, the commissioner sort of gets a print basically saying, these are the entities that are sort of dubious, use this, jao chapa maro, just sort of characterization. So, and that has increased compliance significantly. I think in a similar manner, direct taxes also need to be done. And one key part there is the direct tax code that we have is basically from 1961. Income tax code is 1961. In that, basically, we've had amendments after amendments after amendment, and so it's become hugely voluminous and several internal contradictions as well, which our chartered accountant friends oftentimes actually get a lot of business from. So I think there is a case for basically writing this code, and there is a committee. In fact, I was part of this committee that actually it was headed by first Arvind Modi and then Akhilesh Ranjan. Both were in CBDT.
That's on direct taxes code.
Yes, on direct taxes. Because, a lot of the measures that have been taken, for instance, on faceless assessment, etc., and these are very good measures, the impact of that will actually will increase significantly if some of these, the income tax, basically that act is
right now, amendments and amendments into amendments and amendments. This is Income Tax Act of 1961 is like a bharta. बैंगन का भरता
जिसमें कि from the bharta actually I can pick the tomato and the chili in a convenient way to actually
or in a convenient way on either side.
Exactly.
Either side. So
in some sense, note, I can call the chili tomato in one case, and in another case call the tomato the chili.
Fantastic. That's a good note to conclude this on, because we are heading for meal times. Subbu, thank you very much. As always, this has been a wonderful, candid conversation with you. Stay well.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Print of the Cuff, presented by IIFL Wealth and Asset Management, corporate partner AU Small Finance Bank, in alliance with Indirect Hospitals, airline partner SpiceJet.